A gunshot echoed through the dusty streets of Promise Creek, Montana, the sound splitting the air like thunder on a clear day as Charlotte Cooper fell to the ground, blood pooling beneath her once pristine blue dress. The year was 1876, and what had begun as a simple trip to the general store had ended with her lying in the dirt, the victim of a bank robbery gone wrong. Charlotte's fingers trembled as she pressed her hand against the wound in her side, feeling the warm stickiness of her own blood seeping through her fingers. The world around her faded in and out, the sounds of screaming townsfolk and galloping horses growing distant. The outlaws who had shot her were already disappearing down the street, saddlebags heavy with the bank's money, leaving chaos in their wake. Through blurring vision, she saw a tall figure dismounting from a chestnut stallion, his movements swift and purposeful. The sun silhouetted him, casting his face in shadow beneath the brim of his hat. As consciousness began to slip away, she felt strong arms lifting her, cradling her against a solid chest. A deep voice cut through the haze of her pain. "You're safe now, I've got you," the cowboy said, his voice steady and reassuring despite the urgency in his tone. The last thing Charlotte remembered before darkness claimed her was the scent of leather, tobacco, and something indefinably masculine, the scent of the stranger who had come to her rescue. When Charlotte next opened her eyes, she found herself in an unfamiliar room. Sunlight filtered through lace curtains, casting dappled patterns across a simple quilt that covered her. For a moment, she couldn't recall how she had come to be there, but then the memory of searing pain and the sound of gunfire returned with alarming clarity. She attempted to sit up, only to gasp as pain lanced through her side. The door to the room opened immediately, as if someone had been waiting for just such a sound. "Whoa there, miss. Best not try movin' just yet." It was the same deep voice she remembered from the street. The man who entered was tall and broad-shouldered, with sun-bronzed skin that spoke of long days under the open sky. His hair was the color of dark honey, and his eyes, a startling shade of green, regarded her with concern. He wore simple clothes, a faded blue shirt, well-worn denim pants, and suspenders. No gun belt, she noticed, though she was certain he'd worn one before. "Where am I?" Charlotte asked, her voice hoarse from disuse. "How long have I been here? You're at Doc Sullivan's place." "Been here 2 days now," he replied, approaching with a glass of water. "I'm Xavier Young. Most folks just call me Zav." Charlotte accepted the water gratefully, taking small sips as he continued. "You took a bullet to your side. Doc got it out clean, says you're mighty lucky missed anything important. You lost a fair amount of blood, though." Memory came flooding back: the bank robbery, the gunfire falling to the street. Those men, the bank robbers. Xavier's expression hardened. The Jenkins gang. "Sheriff's got a posse out looking for them, but they know these mountains better than most." Charlotte nodded, exhaustion already pulling at her despite having only been awake for minutes. "Thank you, Mr. Young, for helping me." A slight smile softened his features. "Just doing what anyone would, miss." "Cooper, Charlotte Cooper," she supplied before sleep claimed her once more. Over the next few days, Charlotte drifted in and out of consciousness as her body fought to heal. Each time she woke, Xavier seemed to be there, sometimes reading quietly in a chair by the window, other times just entering with fresh water or broth from the doctor's wife. She learned, in bits and pieces during her more lucid moments, that he worked as the foreman at the Triple R ranch outside of town and had been in Promise Creek to purchase supplies when the robbery occurred. On the 5th day, Charlotte finally felt strong enough to stay awake for more than a few minutes at a time. She was propped up against pillows, watching as Mrs. Sullivan, the doctor's wife, changed the bandage on her wound. "You're healing nicely," the older woman said, her experienced hands working gently. "Another week of rest, and you should be well enough to return to your own place." Charlotte bit her lip. "About that, Mrs. Sullivan, I don't exactly have a place here. I only arrived in Promise Creek the day before the incident. I hadn't even secured lodgings yet." Mrs. Sullivan looked surprised. Well, what brings a young woman like yourself to our little town? I came to take the teaching position at the school, Charlotte explained. The school board wrote that accommodations would be arranged, but I hadn't yet met with them when. When you got shot, Xavier finished, appearing in the doorway with a tray of food. His unexpected presence startled both women. Sorry, didn't mean to eavesdrop, Mrs. Sullivan, Doc's asking for you downstairs. Got a patient with a nasty cough. As the doctor's wife excused herself, Xavier set the tray across Charlotte's lap. The meal was simple chicken, soup, bread, and tea, but it smelled wonderful to someone who had been subsisting on broth for days. So, you're our new schoolteacher, he said, taking what had become his customary seat by the window. Charlotte nodded, breaking off a piece of bread. I imagine they've found someone else by now. Xavier shook his head. Town's been waiting on a proper teacher for months. The preacher's wife has been filling in, but she's expecting a baby soon. Besides, words got around that you're recovering. Folks are waiting. A small wave of relief washed over her. That's good to hear. They fell into comfortable silence as Charlotte ate, though she could feel his eyes on her occasionally. Finally, gathering her courage, she asked the question that had been troubling her. Mr. Young, why have you stayed? Surely you have work to return to at the ranch. Xavier shifted in his chair, his gaze moving to the window where the main street of Promise Creek was visible. Told the boss I needed a few days in town. He understood. He paused, seeming to consider his next words carefully. Truth is, Miss Cooper, I feel somewhat responsible for you. Responsible, but you saved my life. His jaw tightened. I was right there when the shooting started. If I'd been quicker, maybe you wouldn't have been hit at all. Charlotte set down her spoon, surprised by his admission. Mr. Young, you can't possibly blame yourself for the actions of criminals. Maybe not, he conceded, though she could tell he wasn't entirely convinced. Still, seems only right to make sure you're on the mend before I head back. There was something in his voice, a note of genuine concern that touched her deeply. Charlotte had come west alone after losing her parents to influenza the previous year. Having spent the last of her inheritance on the journey from Boston, she had no one to rely on but herself. The idea that this stranger had taken it upon himself to watch over her was both comforting and slightly overwhelming. Well, I appreciate it, she said softly, though I wouldn't want to keep you from your duties. Ranch'll survive without me for a spell longer, he assured her with a small smile. Now you should rest. Doc says that's the best medicine. The following days established a routine. Charlotte grew stronger, able to sit up for longer periods and eventually to stand and take short walks around the room. Xavier continued to visit, often bringing books from the small town library to help pass the time. They discovered a shared love of literature, which led to lively discussions about favorite authors and stories. During one such conversation, Charlotte realized she knew very little about the man who had become her constant companion. How did you come to be in Montana territory, Mr. Young? She asked as they sat by the window, the late afternoon sun bathing the room in golden light. Xavier looked up from the copy of The Last of the Mohicans he'd been leafing through. Born in Pennsylvania, father was a blacksmith, wanted me to follow in his footsteps. A rueful smile crossed his face. I had different ideas. Headed west after the war, worked cattle drives in Texas for a spell, then drifted north. You fought in the war between the states, Charlotte asked, noting that he would have been quite young. Last year of it, lied about my age to enlist. His expression grew distant. Saw enough in those months to last a lifetime, Charlotte nodded, understanding his reluctance to elaborate. And you've been at the Triple R for how long? Going on 5 years now, he replied. It's good work out in the open. Boss is fair, pays decent. Do you ever miss Pennsylvania, your family? A shadow crossed his features. Pa died while I was away at war. Ma followed a few years later, got a brother somewhere in California, but we don't keep in touch. I'm sorry, Charlotte said softly, recognizing the familiar pain of loss in his eyes. My parents passed last year. That's partly why I came west, too many memories in Boston. And the other part? Xavier asked, his perceptiveness catching her off guard. Charlotte hesitated. She rarely spoke of her reasons for leaving the East, but something about Xavier's steady presence made her want to confide in him. I was engaged, she admitted. To the son of my father's business partner. It was expected of me. After my parents died, he revealed himself to be less than the gentleman I thought him to be. When I broke the engagement, he made sure no respectable school in Boston would hire me. Her hands twisted in her lap. So I looked west, where perhaps my scandalous behavior wouldn't follow me. Xavier's expression hardened. Sounds like you're better off without him. Yes, Charlotte agreed, surprised by the vehemence in his tone. I certainly am. A comfortable silence fell between them, broken only when Doc Sullivan entered to check on his patient. Well, Miss Cooper, I'd say you're well enough to leave our care in another day or two, the doctor announced after examining her wound. Though you'll need to take it easy for a while longer. That's wonderful news, Charlotte said, though a flutter of anxiety accompanied her relief. I should speak with the school board about my position and find somewhere to stay. Already taken care of, Xavier interjected. Board members came by yesterday while you were resting. Position's still yours, and Mrs. Willoughby at the boarding house has a room ready whenever you're able. Charlotte blinked in surprise. You arranged all this, just passed along your concerns, he said with a shrug. Folks in this town are good people, they want to help. As the doctor left them, Charlotte found herself studying Xavier's profile as he gazed out the window. In the past week, she had come to rely on his steady presence, his quiet strength. The thought of not seeing him daily left her with an unexpected hollow feeling. I suppose you'll be heading back to the ranch once I'm settled, she said, trying to keep her voice light. Xavier turned to her, his green eyes unreadable. Reckon so, but Promise Creek isn't so big that we won't cross paths now and again. No, I suppose not, Charlotte agreed, though the thought provided little comfort. 2 days later, Xavier escorted Charlotte to Mrs. Willoughby's boarding house. She insisted on walking, though he kept his arm ready for her to lean on when needed. The townspeople they passed greeted them warmly, many stopping to introduce themselves to their new schoolteacher and express relief at her recovery. You're quite the celebrity, Xavier remarked as they continued down the main street. Charlotte laughed, a sound that had become more frequent in recent days. Hardly, though I must admit it's nice to feel welcomed. Small towns, Xavier explained. Everyone knows everyone's business, but when trouble comes, they stand together. Mrs. Willoughby, a cheerful widow in her 50s, showed Charlotte to a modest but comfortable room on the second floor of her well-kept home. It's not fancy, the older woman apologized, but it's clean, and you'll get 2 meals a day included in your board. It's perfect, Charlotte assured her, genuinely pleased with the bright, airy space. After Mrs. Willoughby excused herself, Charlotte turned to find Xavier lingering in the doorway, his hat in his hands. Well, you're all set, he said, an unfamiliar awkwardness in his manner. I should be getting back to the ranch, Charlotte nodded, fighting an unexpected lump in her throat. Yes, of course, you've already done far more than could be expected. It was no trouble, Miss Cooper. Charlotte, she corrected him gently. After all we've been through, I think you can call me Charlotte. A small smile lifted the corner of his mouth. Charlotte, then. And I'm Xavier, not Mr. Young. Xavier, she repeated, liking the way it sounded. Thank you truly for everything, he nodded, placing his hat on his head. The school term starts in 2 weeks, should give you time to fully recover. Will I see you before then? The question slipped out before she could stop it. Something flickered in his eyes, surprise, perhaps, or something else she couldn't name. I usually come into town on Saturdays for supplies. Perhaps we could have coffee at the hotel restaurant. The suggestion was innocent enough, but Charlotte couldn't help the small thrill that ran through her. I would like that very much. With a tip of his hat, Xavier took his leave. Charlotte moved to the window, watching as he mounted his chestnut horse and rode down the street toward the outskirts of town. Only when he had disappeared from view did she realize how accustomed she had grown to his presence. and how empty the room felt without him. The next 2 weeks passed in a flurry of activity as Charlotte prepared for the school term. She met with the school board, familiarized herself with the curriculum, and cleaned and organized the one-room schoolhouse that sat on the edge of town. Throughout it all, her wound continued to heal, though it sometimes ached by day's end. True to his word, Xavier rode into town the following Saturday. Charlotte felt an unexpected flutter of nerves as she spotted him tying his horse outside the general store. She had taken extra care with her appearance that morning, wearing her second-best dress, a simple but flattering garment of deep blue that brought out the color in her eyes. Their coffee extended into lunch as they shared stories and discovered more common interests. Xavier, she learned, had a dry wit that emerged more readily away from the sickroom. His laugh was rare but genuine, transforming his normally serious face into something that made her heart beat a little faster. "The ranch is busy this time of year," he explained as they finished their meal. "Roundup's coming, got cattle to move to summer pasture, and the boss has plans to expand operations." "It sounds challenging," Charlotte observed. "It is, but I enjoy it. Nothing like working under open sky, seeing what your own two hands can accomplish." He paused, studying her. "How about you?" "Looking forward to teaching," Charlotte nodded enthusiastically. "Very much so. There are 32 children enrolled from ages 6 to 16. It will be challenging, but rewarding, I think." As they parted ways that afternoon, Xavier promised to return the following Saturday. Charlotte found herself counting the days, her anticipation growing as the weekend approached. Their meetings became a regular occurrence, coffee or lunch on Saturdays, occasionally extending to a walk through town or along the creek that gave Promise Creek its name. As the weeks passed, Charlotte settled into her role as teacher, winning over her students and their parents with her dedication and innovative teaching methods. One Saturday in late June, nearly 2 months after the shooting, Xavier arrived in town with news. "Boss is sending me to Helena next week," he explained as they sat at their usual table in the hotel restaurant. "Got to pick up some breeding stock he's purchased. I'll be gone for at least 2 weeks. Charlotte ignored the disappointment that settled in her chest. "That sounds like an important responsibility." "It is. Shows he trusts me," Xavier agreed. He hesitated, then added, "I was wondering if you might like to go for a ride tomorrow. Weather's supposed to be fine, and there's a spot up in the foothills I thought you might enjoy seeing." The invitation caught Charlotte by surprise. Their meetings had always been in town, in public view. A private excursion would be something else entirely, something that could potentially set tongues wagging in the small community where she was still establishing her reputation. And yet, the prospect of spending more time with Xavier before his departure was too tempting to refuse. "I'd like that," she said, feeling a blush rise to her cheeks. "Though I should warn you, I'm not much of a horsewoman," he smiled, the expression lighting his green eyes. "Don't worry. I've got a gentle mare that'll take good care of you." The following morning dawned clear and bright, the Montana summer in full glory, as Xavier arrived at the boarding house with 2 horses, his chestnut stallion, and a placid-looking bay mare. "Mrs. Willoughby" gave them a knowing look as Charlotte descended the porch steps in her riding skirt, but said nothing beyond wishing them a pleasant day. Xavier helped Charlotte mount, his hands strong and sure at her waist. The brief contact sent a flutter through her stomach that had nothing to do with nervousness about riding. Once she was settled, he checked the cinch and handed her the reins. "Just relax and let her follow my horse," he instructed. "She knows the trail." They rode at a leisurely pace out of town, following a well-worn path that wound into the foothills east of Promise Creek. Xavier proved to be an attentive guide, pointing out landmarks and sharing stories about the area. As Charlotte grew more comfortable in the saddle, she began to enjoy the rhythm of riding and the spectacular scenery around them. After about an hour, they crested a rise to find a breathtaking view spread before them, the town of Promise Creek nestled in the valley below, surrounded by rolling grasslands that stretched to distant mountains. "It's beautiful," Charlotte breathed as Xavier helped her dismount. "Thought you might like it," he replied, his hands lingering at her waist a moment longer than necessary. "Found this spot my first month at the Triple R, come here sometimes to think." They settled on a sun-warmed outcropping of rock, sharing the picnic lunch misses. Willoughby had packed for them fried chicken, biscuits, and apple pie. The conversation flowed easily between them, as it always did, but Charlotte sensed a new undercurrent, an awareness that had been growing with each meeting. "Can I ask you something, Charlotte?" Xavier said as they watched an eagle soar over the valley below. "Of course." He turned to face her, his expression serious. "Why did you agree to come with me today?" The directness of the question caught her off guard. I enjoy your company." And it seemed like a pleasant way to spend a Sunday. "Is that all?" His gaze was intent, searching. Charlotte's heart quickened. "What are you asking, Xavier?" He moved closer, close enough that she could see the flecks of gold in his green eyes. "I'm asking if you feel what I feel when we're together. This connection between us." The air seemed to still around them. Charlotte had been cautious since arriving in Promise Creek, mindful of her position as the town's teacher and the expectations that came with it. But in that moment, with Xavier looking at her as though she were something precious, caution seemed far less important than honesty. "Yes," she admitted softly, "I feel it too." Relief and something else, joy, perhaps, transformed his features. Slowly, giving her time to pull away if she wished, Xavier leaned forward and pressed his lips to hers. The kiss was gentle, questioning at first, then deeper as Charlotte responded, her hands coming up to rest against his chest. When they finally parted, Charlotte felt breathless, her heart racing. Xavier rested his forehead against hers, his eyes closed as if savoring the moment. "I've wanted to do that for weeks," he confessed. Charlotte smiled, her fingers curling into the fabric of his shirt. "What took you so long?" He laughed, the sound warm and genuine. "Wasn't sure a fine, educated lady like yourself would be interested in a rough cowboy." "You're hardly rough," Charlotte countered, brushing her fingers along his jaw. "You're the kindest, most honorable man I've ever known." They stayed on the hillside until the sun began its descent toward the western horizon, talking and sharing occasional kisses. As they rode back to town in the golden light of late afternoon, Charlotte felt a happiness she hadn't experienced in years, perhaps ever. At the boarding house, Xavier helped her dismount, his hands gentle at her waist. "I'll be leaving for Helena at first light Tuesday," he said, reluctance evident in his voice. "But I'd like to call on you when I return properly this time, if that's agreeable to you." Charlotte nodded, unable to suppress her smile. "Very agreeable, Mr. Young." He grinned at her formal address, tipping his hat. "Until then, Miss Cooper." The 2 weeks of Xavier's absence stretched interminably for Charlotte, despite the distraction of her teaching duties. She found herself watching the road from the schoolhouse window, hoping for a glimpse of his familiar figure on horseback, though she knew it was too soon for his return. During this time, Charlotte became better acquainted with the townspeople of Promise Creek. Mrs. Sullivan invited her to tea, where she met several of the local ladies who made up the town's social circle. They were curious about the developing friendship between their new teacher and the Triple R foreman, but Charlotte maintained a careful discretion, sharing only that Mr. Young had been kind enough to show her some of the local countryside. When Xavier finally returned, it was with a flourish that took the town by surprise. He arrived not on horseback, but driving a smart buggy pulled by a handsome pair of matched grays. He had barely reached the boarding house before word spread through Promise Creek that Xavier Young was calling formally on the schoolteacher. Mrs. Willoughby answered his knock, her eyes twinkling as she ushered him into the parlor where Charlotte waited, her heart racing with anticipation. Xavier looked different, freshly barbered, wearing a new shirt and string tie. He held his hat in his hands, turning it nervously as he greeted her. "You look lovely," he said, his gaze taking in her simple but becoming dress of sage green. "Thank you." You clean up rather well yourself, she replied with a smile. Is that a new buggy I saw you driving? A hint of color touched his tanned cheeks. Figured if I'm going to court a lady properly, I ought to have a decent rig to take her around in. The word court sent a pleasant thrill through Charlotte. Is that what you're doing, courting me? He met her eyes directly. If you'll allow it, yes. I believe I will, she said softly. The weeks that followed were some of the happiest of Charlotte's life. Xavier called on her regularly, taking her for drives in his new buggy, escorting her to church on Sundays, and occasionally joining her for dinner at the boarding house under Mrs. Willoughby's approving eye. As summer gave way to autumn, their feelings for each other deepened. Xavier began spending more time in town, arranging his work at the ranch so he could see Charlotte several times a week. The townsfolk, initially curious about the match, soon accepted it as natural. The brave cowboy and the teacher he had rescued, brought together by Providence. On a crisp October evening, with the cottonwoods along the creek turning golden, Xavier took Charlotte for a sunset drive. They followed the creek upstream to a peaceful spot where the water widened into a small pond, reflecting the fiery colors of the sky. I've been thinking, Xavier said as they sat side by side on a blanket he had spread on the ground. Charlotte leaned against his shoulder, comfortable in his presence. About what? The future. My future. He turned to face her, taking her hands in his. Charlotte, these past months have been the happiest I can remember. Being with you, it's changed me. Her heart quickened at the intensity in his eyes. It's changed me too. I've been saving all these years at the Triple R, he continued. Never had much reason to spend what I earned. There's a piece of land for sale, just north of town. Good water, decent grazing, small cabin that needs work but has potential. Charlotte's breath caught as she began to understand where this conversation was leading. I've put in an offer, Xavier said, his voice steady despite the vulnerability in his eyes. If you could see yourself sharing that kind of life, I'd be honored to make it our home. Xavier, are you proposing? She whispered. He released her hands to reach into his pocket, withdrawing a small velvet box. Opening it, he revealed a delicate gold ring set with a single pearl. I am Charlotte Cooper, I love you. Will you marry me? Tears sprang to her eyes as joy welled up inside her. Yes, she said, her voice breaking. Yes, I will marry you. Xavier's face lit with happiness as he slipped the ring onto her finger. Then he was kissing her, his arms pulling her close as she wound hers around his neck. The kiss was a promise, filled with all the love and hope they felt for their future together. Their engagement was met with enthusiasm by the people of Promise Creek. The school board, after some discussion, agreed that Charlotte could continue teaching until the end of the term in December, with the wedding to take place during the Christmas holiday. Xavier threw himself into preparing their future home, riding out to the property whenever his duties at the Triple R permitted. Charlotte joined him when she could, helping to plan renovations to the cabin and dreaming about the life they would build together. On one such visit in late November, with the first snow dusting the ground, they stood on what would soon be their front porch, arms wrapped around each other for warmth. It's not much compared to what you might have had in Boston, Xavier said, a hint of uncertainty in his voice. Charlotte shook her head, looking out over the land that stretched before them, their land. It's everything I want, a home, purpose, and you. She turned in his arms to face him. I never would have found any of this if not for that terrible day in the street. Xavier's expression sobered at the reminder of how they had met. I still dream about it sometimes, seeing you fall, the blood. His arms tightened around her protectively. Then I wake up and remember you're safe, that we found each other in spite of it all. Or because of it, Charlotte suggested. Perhaps some good can come even from the darkest moments. As their wedding day approached, preparations consumed much of Charlotte's time. The ladies of Promise Creek rallied around her, helping to sew her wedding dress and prepare for the small reception that would follow the ceremony at the church. Xavier, meanwhile, completed his employment at the Triple R. parting from his boss on good terms with the promise of future business between the ranch and his new enterprise. The deed to their property was officially recorded at the county seat, and the cabin renovations were finished just in time for their December wedding. On Christmas Eve, with snow falling softly outside the church windows, Charlotte walked down the aisle to where Xavier waited, his eyes filled with wonder and love as he watched her approach. She wore a gown of ivory silk, simple but elegant, with a crown of winter greenery in her dark hair. As they exchanged vows before the gathered townspeople, who had become friends and chosen family in the months since her arrival, Charlotte marveled at the journey that had brought her to this moment. From the terror and pain of the shooting to the joy of standing beside the man she loved, promising to share his life. "I now pronounce you husband and wife," the preacher declared, beaming at the couple. "You may kiss your bride, Mr. Young." Xavier lifted Charlotte's veil and leaned down to kiss her, his touch gentle but full of promise. The church erupted in applause and cheers as they turned to face their community as husband and wife. The reception was held at the hotel, its dining room festively decorated for both Christmas and the wedding. There was dancing and laughter, with even the children from Charlotte's school in attendance, excited to see their teacher become a bride. As the evening drew to a close, Xavier guided the buggy through the snowy night toward their new home. Charlotte nestled against him beneath heavy blankets to ward off the cold. "Are you happy, Mrs. Young?" he asked, his breath forming clouds in the frigid air. Charlotte looked up at him, her heart so full it felt it might burst. "Happier than I ever imagined possible." He smiled down at her, then returned his attention to the road. "We're home," he said moments later as they crested a small rise, and their cabin came into view, windows glowing with welcoming light. Xavier had ridden ahead earlier in the day to light the fires and prepare for their arrival. Now, as he carried Charlotte across the threshold, she saw the home they would share for the first time as a married woman. The main room was warm and inviting, with a cheerful fire crackling in the hearth. Fresh pine boughs decorated the mantel, filling the air with their fragrance, and a small Christmas tree stood in one corner, adorned with simple ornaments. "It's beautiful," she whispered, touched by his thoughtfulness. Xavier set her gently on her feet but kept his arms around her. "Welcome home, Charlotte." Spring arrived early the following year, bringing with it new life and possibilities. Charlotte and Xavier fell easily into the rhythm of married life, working side by side to establish their small ranch. Xavier had purchased a modest herd of cattle and a few horses, focusing on quality breeding stock rather than quantity. Charlotte, who had finished the school term in December, now divided her time between helping with the ranch and tutoring several students whose parents preferred individual instruction. On a warm May morning, almost exactly a year after the shooting that had brought them together, Charlotte stood on the porch of their cabin, watching as Xavier worked with a young colt in the corral. His patience with the animal, the gentle firmness with which he guided it, never failed to impress her. She rested her hand unconsciously on her abdomen, where the first subtle signs of their child had begun to make themselves known. She hadn't told Xavier yet, wanting to be certain before sharing the news that would change their lives once again. But as he looked up, catching her eye across the yard and smiling that smile that still made her heart race, Charlotte knew it was time. Xavier seemed to sense her mood as he joined her on the porch, wiping his brow with a bandana. "Something on your mind, sweetheart," Charlotte nodded, taking his weathered hand in hers and placing it gently against her still flat stomach. "We're going to have a baby, Xavier, in late autumn." His eyes widened, a mixture of shock and joy crossing his face. "A baby, you're sure? Dr. Sullivan confirmed it yesterday when I was in town," she affirmed, watching his reaction closely. Xavier let out a whoop of joy, lifting Charlotte off her feet and spinning her in a circle before setting her down hastily. "Should I be doing that? Is it safe for the baby? Charlotte laughed, touched by his immediate concern. I'm not made of glass, Xavier. The baby and I are fine. He placed his hand reverently back on her abdomen, wonder in his eyes. A family, he said softly, our family. As the months passed, their happiness only grew. Xavier fussed over Charlotte endlessly, making sure she didn't overtax herself while simultaneously expanding their cabin to include a nursery. The community of Promise Creek celebrated with them, the ladies organizing a quilting bee to create a baby blanket, while the men helped Xavier with the building work. In late October, as the aspens turned golden and the air grew crisp, Charlotte went into labor. Xavier, panic barely concealed beneath a veneer of calm, raced to town to fetch Dr. Sullivan, returning with not only the doctor but also Mrs. Sullivan and Mrs. Willoughby, both experienced in matters of childbirth. After hours of labor that tested Charlotte's strength and Xavier's nerves, their daughter was born a healthy girl with a shock of dark hair and her father's green eyes. They named her Emma Grace Young, Emma after Xavier's mother and Grace for the blessing she represented in their lives. As Charlotte held their daughter for the first time, Xavier sitting beside them on the bed with his arm around his wife's shoulders, she thought about the strange turns of fate that had led them to this moment. A year and a half ago, I was lying in the street, bleeding and afraid, she mused, stroking Emma's tiny cheek. And now look at us. Xavier pressed a kiss to Charlotte's temple, his gaze full of love as he looked from his wife to his newborn daughter. You're safe now, he whispered, echoing the words he had spoken on that fateful day. I've got you both. And as night fell over their small ranch, with the stars appearing one by one in the vast Montana sky, the young family began the first of many peaceful evenings together. Bound by a love that had been born in a moment of crisis, but had grown into something enduring and beautiful, a love that would sustain them through all the adventures and challenges that lay ahead in their shared life on the frontier. 5 years passed, bringing changes both to the young family and to Promise Creek itself. The small settlement grew into a proper town with the arrival of the railroad, bringing new businesses and settlers. Xavier and Charlotte's ranch prospered, expanding to include not only cattle but also horses, as Xavier's skill as a breeder became known throughout the territory. Emma, now 5 years old, was the light of her parents' lives, a spirited, curious child with her father's green eyes and her mother's quick mind. She was joined by a brother, Samuel, a sturdy 3-year-old with a shock of sandy hair and a mischievous grin that could charm his way out of almost any trouble. Charlotte had returned to teaching part-time at the new, larger schoolhouse in town, bringing Emma and occasionally Samuel with her on the days she taught. The arrangement allowed her to maintain her passion for education while still being present for her children and helping Xavier with the ranch. One summer evening, as the family sat on their expanded front porch watching the sunset paint the sky in brilliant hues, Emma climbed onto Charlotte's lap with a storybook in hand. "Mama, will you read to us?" she asked, her eyes bright with anticipation. "The one about the princess and the knight." Charlotte smiled, settling Emma more comfortably against her while Samuel leaned against his father's legs. "Of course, sweetheart." As Charlotte read, Xavier watched his family, a contentment so deep it was almost painful, filling his chest. The life they had built together far exceeded any dreams he might have had as a young man drifting west after the war. A home, children, a wife who continued to fascinate and delight him, blessings he never thought would be his. Later that night, with the children asleep and the house quiet, Xavier found Charlotte standing by the window in their bedroom, gazing out at the moonlit landscape. "Penny for your thoughts," he said softly, coming to stand behind her and wrapping his arms around her waist. Charlotte leaned back against him, sighing contentedly. "I was just thinking about how full our lives are, how fortunate we've been." "We have," he agreed, pressing a kiss to her neck, "though I like to think we've earned some of that good fortune through hard work." She turned in his arms to face him, her blue eyes serious in the dim light. I received a letter today from Boston. Thomas Harrington, my former fiancé, has died. Xavier's brows drew together in surprise. I'm sorry, are you upset? Charlotte shook her head. Not in the way you might think. It's strange, I once thought I would spend my life with him, bear his children, grow old in his house in Boston. And now he's gone, and I feel only a distant sadness for a life cut short. He didn't treat you well, Xavier reminded her gently, remembering what she had told him about the broken engagement. No, he didn't, Charlotte agreed, but in an odd way I owe him a debt. If he hadn't revealed his true character, if I hadn't broken that engagement and been forced to seek a position far from Boston. She gestured around them, encompassing their home, their life together. I might never have found all this, found you. Xavier cupped her face in his hands, marveling as he often did at the twists of fate that had brought them together. I think we were meant to find each other, one way or another, though I wish it hadn't required you getting shot. Charlotte smiled, covering his hands with her own. A small price to pay in the end. The following spring brought a visitor to Promise Creek, Charlotte's cousin Elizabeth, traveling west after the death of her husband. She stayed with the Youngs at their ranch, marveling at the life her formerly proper Bostonian cousin had created in the Montana territory. I hardly recognize you, Elizabeth confessed as they watched the children playing in the yard with Xavier. You were always so, contained. Now look at you, a ranch wife with dirt under your nails and sun on your face, happier than I've ever seen you. Charlotte laughed, acknowledging the truth in her cousin's observation. Life out here changes you, strips away pretenses, you learn what really matters, and what really matters. Elizabeth asked curiously. Charlotte's gaze drifted to Xavier, who was showing Emma how to throw a lasso, his patience infinite as she tried again and again. Love, family, building something that lasts. Elizabeth stayed for a month before continuing her journey to San Francisco, leaving behind a stack of books for Charlotte and toys for the children. Her visit had been a welcome connection to Charlotte's past, but as the stagecoach disappeared down the road, Charlotte felt no pull to follow, no longing for the life she had left behind. As the years continued to pass, the young family faced challenges along with their joys. A harsh winter nearly devastated their cattle herd, requiring Xavier and Charlotte to work side by side through blizzards to save as many animals as possible. A drought the following summer tested their resources and resolve. And when 7-year-old Samuel fell from a horse and broke his arm, both parents endured sleepless nights of worry until he healed. Yet through it all, their bond only strengthened. The children grew, thriving in the freedom and responsibility of ranch life while receiving an education that combined Charlotte's academic knowledge with Xavier's practical skills. When Promise Creek celebrated its 25th anniversary as an incorporated town, the Youngs were honored as one of the founding families. Now in their 40s, with Emma preparing to attend college in Denver and Samuel showing every sign of following in his father's footsteps as a rancher, Xavier and Charlotte stood proudly with their community as the festivities unfolded. Remember when you were just the new school teacher and I was the Triple R foreman? Xavier murmured as they watched a parade make its way down what was now a proper main street, complete with boardwalks and gas lamps. Charlotte squeezed his hand, smiling up at him. The years had added silver to his honey-colored hair and lines around his eyes, but to her, he was as handsome as the day he had lifted her from the dusty street. How could I forget? You saved my life. And you saved mine, he replied, his voice husky with emotion, just in a different way. That evening, as the celebration continued with music and dancing in the town square, Xavier led Charlotte away from the crowds to a quiet spot overlooking the creek. The moon was rising, casting silver light over the water, much as it had on their wedding night so many years before. I have something for you, Xavier said, reaching into his pocket to withdraw a small package wrapped in tissue paper. Charlotte opened it carefully to find a delicate gold locket. Inside was a miniature photograph of their family: Xavier, Charlotte, Emma, and Samuel, taken the previous Christmas. "It's beautiful," she said, tears springing to her eyes as Xavier fastened the chain around her neck. "20 years ago today, I asked you to marry me," he reminded her. "Best decision I ever made." Charlotte touched the locket resting against her heart. "Mine too." As they returned to the celebration, greeting friends and neighbors, accepting congratulations on Emma's college scholarship and Samuel's success at the county fair, Charlotte reflected on the journey that had brought them to this point. From that moment of terror and pain in the street to the rich, full life they now shared, it was a path she couldn't have imagined, yet one she would choose again without hesitation. Later that night, as they prepared for bed in the comfortable farmhouse that had replaced the original cabin as their family grew, Xavier caught her in a gentle embrace. "Happy?" he asked, the word encompassing 2 decades of shared history. Charlotte nodded, leaning into his familiar strength. "Beyond measure." As they drifted to sleep in each other's arms, Charlotte thought of all the nights they had shared this way through childbirth and illness, celebration and sorrow, the ordinary and the extraordinary moments that made up a life together. And through it all, the words Xavier had spoken to her that first day had remained true. She was safe, and he had her, just as she had him, a promise kept through all the years of their journey together in the wild Montana country they now called home.